Extolling the benefits of Canada's oil sands might be a tough sell for many people, but not for Rick George. The former Suncor CEO turned a faltering oil company into the darling of Canada's oil patch. And joining us now to challenge the oil sands critics and shed some light on Canada's future energy needs, here's Rick George, recently retired President and CEO for Suncor Energy and the author of Sunrise, Suncor, the Oil Sands, and the Future of Energy. And we're happy to welcome you into that chair here at TVO tonight.
Steve, I'm delighted to be here with you.
I want to start with just a little background because those of us of a certain age will remember the name Suncor, and not necessarily for wonderful reasons.
Right.
30 years ago, we owned a PCU, didn't we?
The Ontario government did, yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, the Ontario taxpayers.
Yeah.
We owned a quarter of your company to buy a quote-unquote window on the oil world, right?
That's right.
How'd that go?
Well, you know, they actually bought it, I think, in the middle of the 80s and sold it in 1992 and 93. It was one of those cases, Steve, where they bought high and sold low, which is obviously the opposite of what you want to do. But that's actually kind of what happened.
Did it make sense at the time for the government of Ontario to make that purchase, in your view?
Well, if you remember back, and I didn't live in Canada then, but the federal government was establishing Petro-Canada, and so I think it was just an offset to that in lots of ways, kind of from a political and from an economic viewpoint.
Now, in the early 90s when we sold that company, we sold it because the economy was terrible, we needed the money, et cetera, et cetera. Had we hung on to our shares, how would we have done?
Well, today the shares trade somewhere around $33, $34, and if you take back, because the stock has split several times, it would be back at about $2 a share, $2.50 a share. The reason I know that is I still own some of those shares.
So we shouldn't have sold, is what you're saying. Had we hung on, we'd have been better off.
The timing is always important, isn't it?
That's nicely put. Okay, let's move on to find out why this was called once upon a time the unluckiest oil company in Canada. Why did people call it that?
Well, really it deals around this whole oil sands business, which has always been a big part of Suncor. And if you think about it, the first plant was put in, which was the Suncor plant in 1967. For 25 years, it struggled to make a return above its cost of capital. So it was only in the 1990s, middle of the 1990s, that we used a bunch of technologies to get the cost of production down. Oil prices started to move up. And then we started to have a margin you could actually work with. That also meant a lot of other players came into the oil sands about the same time.
And you took a company that was doing $1 billion of business when you got there, and by the time you left, you were up to $50 billion.
Yeah, market cap, that's right, exactly.
Okay, you want to give us sort of the bullet points on how you managed to turn that around?
Well, it's detailed in my book, but obviously it's a work by a lot of hard people. No single individual does everything, right? And so I just was very lucky to lead a very good, talented group of people. And we make some really big bets at the right time.
What was the biggest bet?
The biggest bet was actually Project Millennium, which we decided to double the size of the plant in 1998. And crude was at $12 a barrel. And if you remember, the Economist had a front page that said crude was going to $5 a barrel. We made the decision on a $2 billion project that ended up to be about $3.4 billion at the end of the day. But the bet paid off big time for our shareholders.
You bet on cycles, right? You just assumed it was going to go triple digits at some point.
It's very important when you're in a cyclic industry to understand the cycles and to actually understand that a lot of times your best bets are made right at the bottom of the cycle. Usually your worst decisions are made at the top of the cycle.
And how much oil does Suncor produce today?
Today it would be, I'm thinking back to the right numbers, but 400,000 barrels a day.
400,000? And that puts you where on the rankings in the world?
Oh, we would be the fourth largest in North America. We would not be in the top, they would not be in the top 10 in terms of world production.
Again, a little background. You're a guy from a small town in Colorado, right?
Yeah, right.
Brush, Colorado. What did you say in the book? Something like more cattle than people or something like that.
It's a very small town.
Okay, and now you're up here, been here for a long time, Canadian citizen. You're not wearing your Order of Canada today, but you've got one. So my question is, how much did you really know about the oil sands when you just showed up to Canada for the first time?
I didn't know a lot, to be honest with you. The only thing that I knew is it wasn't performing well and that we actually had to make big change to make it viable. And those things were obvious, right? It was kind of the how do you make it better that was so important. And again, we started to make changes predominantly in the mining operation that helped us reduce costs.
And once you got into Suncor and started to run it and make the decisions about the oil sands, give us a better understanding of the scope of the business that Suncor is doing there now.
Well, we produced in 1991, 92 about 50,000 barrels a day, and from that operation alone about 350,000 barrels a day today. So, I mean, you know, that's a 7 times increase in a 20-year period. It's been quite dramatic and a lot of fun along the way, I will tell you that.
A lot of fun?
Yep.
What was fun?
Well, you know, I always believe that hard work is very important. Running companies is really about principles and values and hiring very good people. I also think even in large corporations, it's okay to enjoy where you work and have fun while you're doing it.
Making a lot of money fun too?
Obviously, yeah. It's been great for our shareholders.
Yeah,
it's been great for our shareholders.
Just oil, or are you into natural gas there as well, or other things?
The company produces natural gas as well, especially more natural gas after the merger with Petro-Canada.
And are you into partnerships with other oil companies there on projects as well?
Absolutely. We did a big deal with Total a couple of years ago,
the French
the French company.
We actually had Jean-Michel Gier in that chair not too long ago.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Which was obviously very good partnership for them and for Suncor.
In which case, how important would you characterize Suncor's involvement in the oil sands to the company's overall bottom line?
Well, it's 70% of the earnings and cash flow of the company.
70%?
It's roughly that. So it's very important.
Okay, that's the business side of things. I now want to read you something that James Hansen, who's the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, you know what's coming here, climate change activist, here's what he has to say about the oil sands. He says as follows: if we were to fully exploit this new oil source and continue to burn our conventional oil, gas, and coal supplies, concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere eventually would reach levels higher than in the Pliocene era more than 2.5 million years ago. Sea levels would rise and destroy coastal cities. Global temperatures would become intolerable. 20 to 50% of the planet's species would be driven to extinction. Civilization would be at risk. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to comment on that because I think his facts are totally wrong, and it's hard to kind of rationalize that. You know, the sky is falling is always kind of an easy tack to take. So what you have to remember, and just to put this in some perspective, is the oil sands industry today produces about 5% of Canada's CO2 emissions, and Canada produces 2% of the world's emissions. So if you look at this, it's a very small fraction. And just to have some perspective, our whole industry produces less CO2 than the state of Indiana does producing electricity from coal. And so listen, to single out a single individual and say that's the whole problem, I think doesn't hold a lot of water.
Would you disagree with the notion that the oil sands development is contributing to climate change somewhat?
You know, I tend not to get into the climate change argument. We've made dramatic improvements as an industry. So I want to talk about the industry improvement on the environmental side. Over the last 10 years, CO2 on a unit of production basis is down 30%, water use is down 40%, land reclamation is moving much quicker, like 3 times the speed it was a decade ago. So vast improvements, which I expect to continue over the next 10 years as new leadership takes over.
Okay, improvements are good, but do you think it is contributing to climate change?
Well, you know, listen, if people are worried about CO2, then obviously oil is one of the pieces of the equation. Coal is also very big. Every source of energy in the world has an impact on the planet. There's no question about that.
There was a study out of the University of Waterloo, I think, that suggested that the oil sands development is not a major source of air and water pollution. Is that a reputable study in your view?
Absolutely. It's a university of great credibility. I mean, you know, not everybody would agree with it, but I think it's really important to remember that we are establishing world-class air water monitoring systems in the northern part of Alberta that are put in by the federal and the provincial regulators, supported by environmentalists who are solutions-oriented, and by the industry. That'll tell you a lot about what is occurring up north in the northern part of Alberta.
The reason I ask about the study is that, of course, your company contributed to the funding of the study, and that will make it illegitimate in the eyes of some. Is that a problem?
Well, you know, listen, we do all kinds of studies. It was certainly not something that the company was biased or overly involved in.
Overly involved, meaning you had some involvement in the
study?
study?
You know, I actually don't know the facts. We probably should get Suncor to answer that question today.
What do you think is the biggest misunderstanding people have about what's going on in the oil sands today?
I think what they really miss is that thing I was talking about how much it has improved in terms of its environmental performance over the last 10 years, and how technology will continue to drive that to a much better place over the next 10 and 20 years.
Would you agree, though, that the debate today seems to be one more of public relations, and the other side is, the other side's eating your lunch most days of the week, don't you think?
Well, we've made some real strides as an industry over the last 2 or 3 years. We obviously have been better at getting our side and the facts out on the table. And I think that has actually made a huge difference, particularly here in Canada. And if you read the polls here in Canada, generally 70% of the people would say oil sands should be developed. Now, at the same time, Steve, they're going to tell you it's got to be done in the right way and in a sustainable way. But the industry agrees with that. I don't know a single person in the industry that would not agree with that statement.
Who do you think's winning the debate right now, though?
Well, I think, we're getting more facts out on the table, less emotion. What we actually need is to get out of a polarized debate and into having a discussion. I hope my book leads to some of that, because I think I take a fairly balanced view in that book about what both sides represent.
Some of those on the other side, though, are on the other side because they think we ought not to be on oil at all, period, full stop. What can you say? I mean, you're looking for a less polarized debate, but what can you say to people who have that belief?
Then you've got to work on solutions. And so then you've got to come up with solutions. And solutions that are not just good for energy usage, both production and consumption, but employment, employing youth, tax dollars raised, because this industry pays some of the largest tax and royalty dollars in this entire country, which go to support social and other programs. It's always easy to say what you're against. Saying what you're for that's realistic and works, that's a much tougher job.
I am now, of course, not going to be able to find the page where I read this, but somewhere in this book I read that over the next 25 years we've got more than $700 billion in revenues to the federal and Alberta provincial governments that would be at risk if the oil sands did not go forward. Am I close on that?
If it did not exist, yeah, that's a good number.
But the follow-up question to that is, if it's killing the planet, does it matter if it's $700 billion into our treasury?
Well, I would take the argument it's not killing the planet. This industry is very well regulated and on a continuous improvement track.
What does oil have to sell for per barrel for the oil sands to make economic sense for Suncor?
Well, I'll talk about the industry. It's probably better at this point that I don't talk about the company that I no longer am involved with.
Sure.
But generally to support both the initial capital investment and operating costs, you're going to need something just north of $70 a barrel consistently. Of course, today crude oil trades above $90.
So as long as it's where it's at right now, things are going to go forward. But you're in a cyclical business, as you've already pointed out.
Absolutely.
So if it goes down, do people leave?
No. I think the industry's taking a very long-term view of this, and so you tend to invest through the cycles. These businesses are 50 and 100-year businesses. They're not ones that are going to go away. I think we got to go back, Steve, to kind of a broader discussion in terms of if you actually believe, and I happen to, that we're going to raise hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people out of poverty in Asia, in South America, in Africa. We're going to improve the standard of living around the world. We don't have a case yet where you do that without increased energy use. So I'm a big proponent, as I discuss in the book, about multiple energy sources and multiple channels that moves through. Oil will certainly be a big piece of that. Not the biggest piece, but a piece of that going forward.
We're going to get to other parts of that equation later, but I just want to finish up here on the oil option. As we all know, Alberta and Saskatchewan are landlocked, so you want to get the oil out of there, you got to ship it somehow. And you do discuss some of the options in the book here, and I was interested to read that you think doing Keystone XL to the United States, but having that be your only way out of the province, is not a good idea because it makes us captive to a single customer. Can you talk about that?
Well, if you think about energy generally, oil, gas, and electricity, which we export out of this country, we only have one customer, and that is the United States. And so if you think about it from a Canadian nationalist viewpoint, or as I always refer to it, Canada Inc. and US Inc., it's never a great idea for a business owner or a manufacturer to have only one customer, because sooner or later they've got power, and that's kind of what happened in the Keystone event. That's why I think one pipeline to the West Coast is important. It brings back in a more balanced discussion with your major customer and gives you an option.
But basically what you're saying is we can't just do Keystone. We've got to do the one out west. We've got to somehow get it to the east. So can I go through a bit of a list here?
Sure.
Okay, Keystone's one. Pacific Rim's another one. Coming east to Ontario, Quebec's another one. How about up north to the Arctic? Is that an option, going north?
I've not spent a lot of time looking at that, but I would doubt that that's a real viable option. Our best option is the two that are on the table now, looking at the West Coast, which is the Kinder Morgan option and the Enbridge option. Both of those look very viable to me.
Not necessarily the Premier of British Columbia, though. What advice would you give her on
that's always down to a political discussion, isn't it? And so, I think you got to kind of look at that with some lens about people trying to keep their positions.
So she is taking the position that there's no pipeline going to go through British Columbia unless her demands are met. You think it's just, at the end of the day, it's about making a deal?
I don't know. I don't want to get overly involved in those politics because I haven't been involved. What I would say is, it's really important for Canada that at times provincial leaders take a position that's good for all Canadians, not just in their own special interests.
They don't do that anymore,
I know they don't,
The days of
but we
national-looking premiers are gone, just about.
It's one of the challenges of Confederation. I grant you that. But listen, it's a great society. We've got a great country. What we should have is an even-handed discussion about it.
Let's, in our remaining moments here, talk about some of the alternative sources of energy, which actually your former business is involved in as well. To what extent do you think renewable energy sources like sun and wind are going to be capable of fulfilling our energy needs?
Listen, I think they're an important part of the pie. They're never going to be a big source. And even if you look at, for example, Spain's issues now, they put in a lot of wind power. It's ended up to be very expensive and has not helped their economy as they've gone into this deep recession. Germany is finding out some of the same things in terms of their energy production base. And we see it here in Ontario as well, in terms of some of the highest electricity rates in this country actually are here in Ontario. But I still am a big supporter of it for a thin piece of the pie. We need to continue to develop the technology and continue to move forward. But to think wholesale that this is going to be a huge source of the future energy on a massive scale, I think is a little misguided at this point.
That's what the Germans are banking on. They're getting out of nukes altogether.
Yeah, they haven't shut them down yet, have they?
No, but they say they will.
Yeah.
And if they do, can they do it with renewables only?
I don't believe so.
So what percentage do you see going forward? I don't know where we are today. Are we 15% renewable energy in Ontario right now?
Oh, you'd be below 10.
Below
sure.
10,
Yeah.
Okay, so not even. Where do you see that number going as we go forward?
10% to 10 to 15% over the next 10 years would be a great number if you could get it to that point. The issue is you got to do that in a way that makes sure that we do not increase power prices dramatically, because again, we're in a fairly fragile economy, particularly here in Ontario. And you need to worry about, if you were a business owner, would Ontario be one of the shops you would set up new businesses at if your electricity rates are too high?
The Premier, the outgoing now Premier of Ontario, insists that the price of everything when it starts is high and everything comes down. Do you see renewable energy costs coming down?
Over time, absolutely. Technology on all kinds of fronts are going to make improvements. So I don't think there's any question we're going to see improvements on solar, on wind, and on other issues. None of them are obviously a free lunch on anything, but you're going to see improvements, I think.
Bottom line, do we have anything else out there right now that could replace oil?
Well, your best near term is actually natural gas. And natural gas, because it contains less carbon, and luckily, again, given new technology, we've got an abundance of natural gas in North America.
So we should be investing in that to get us, what, through the next 20 or 30 years or so?
30 or 40 years, yeah.
30 or 40?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Let me ask you one last thing, Mr. George, and that is that you've written this book. What do you hope it's going to do?
Well, listen, the book is really a discussion around leadership, which is always kind of high on my agenda. It's also really, I think, a book around a great Canadian success story. I don't consider it personal, but we are surrounded with cases like Nortel or even today RIM, where things have not always turned out as one might hope. This is actually a great company that was developed over a 20-year period and a great Canadian story. So it's more about that, hopefully with an even-handed discussion with the environment thrown in.
It was an American company. You've made it a Canadian company.
Absolutely.
And you were an American, and now you're a Canadian.
Yeah. A very proud Canadian.
Does that feel odd to you ever, as a guy who was sort of born and raised in the United States, and now you describe yourself as being a pretty staunch Canadian nationalist now?
No, I think it comes naturally. My children are all basically kind of raised here over the last 20 years. Obviously we do a lot of business on both sides of the border, but you gotta remember I spent 10 years in the UK before moving to Canada, so I understand the political system pretty well. The history of Canada is very important, and I love this country.
Sunrise. Suncor, the oil sands and the future of energy. That's the name of the book by Rick George, the former CEO of Suncor. Thanks for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Steve, thank you very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.